We have heard the big picture trend about the Ivy League and Power 5 conference institutions growing in enrollment, while smaller secondary schools may be declining. However, this big picture trend may only be applicable in some regions of the country. With rapid population growth in southern and western markets, what has been observed in the Power 5, Ivy Leagues, and regional institutions? On May 9th at the SHURE Initiative in Washington, D.C., Charles Matthews, CEO of College House, took a granular look at PBSA trends across the U.S. and academic institutions' financial viability, allowing you to draw your own conclusions. Proposed discussion points included hype and gossip versus data analytics, why you should understand the difference. The power of data analytics, one giant leap for university planning and PBSA executives. What the data tells us about supply-demand balances and imbalances around the U.S. Breaking down the data. What is an analytics platform and how can PBSA executives benefit from its performance metrics? What's the next chapter for data analytics in the PBSA industry? What type of software is around the corner and what new conclusions might we draw? Charles Matthews was introduced by Debra Nauta-Rodriguez, Associate VP of Facilities and the University Architect at the Catholic University of America.
Debbie, as she is known, in the facilities group oversee the stewardship of the university's places and spaces, including 51 buildings, over 2 million gross square feet, over 173 acres. So when we say that these universities are major landlords and impact the environment overall, we mean it. 51 buildings, 2.5 million square feet, over 173 acres at the Catholic University of America. And Debbie leads a diverse workforce responsible for campus planning, design, construction, and facilities management. So with that, I'm going to bring up Debra Nauta-Rodriguez. Debbie, come on up.
Good morning. Welcome to Washington, D.C. I've spent pretty much my whole professional career in this city. And when Brian asked me to be involved with this conference, he wanted me to speak on one of the panels. And I said, no, I'm only interested in going to learn. So then he asked me, okay, well, maybe you can introduce one of our speakers. So that's my function here this morning, introducing the first speaker, Charlie Matthews, founder and CEO of House Analytics. He's the founder of House Analytics, which is a dynamic brand ecosystem that includes College House and Senior House. Spearheading innovation in commercial real estate intelligence, House Analytics empowers professionals with advanced tools for well-informed decision-making across a range of business lines. So please join me in welcoming Charlie Matthews.
Those were a lot of big words. So thank you so much, Debbie. Good morning. Good morning. I told Brian I'd try and walk around here, trying to make sure I don't look back the whole time, so I got the slides here, but awesome. I always try and start things off with a joke, and when I was talking about coming to DC, I texted my friend Will Baker, and I said, are you going to DC? And he goes, for sure? I said, for sure. And we kept saying, for sure, for sure. So Brian, I love the name. It helped me make a good joke there, so I'm excited to be here. Kicking off this discussion, I think, in a lot of the conferences that I speak at, is setting the precedent and kind of laying the table for a lot of the discussions. College House, which is our student housing platform, we aggregate analytics across 280 university markets, about 350 schools, where we're tracking performance data, primarily the off-campus, as well as enrollments, all of your on-campus metrics, and new pipeline supply. Student housing is very unique in which you have kind of two facets kind of working in tandem. You have the on-campus, which is university managed, owned, run, and then you also have the private off-campus market, where whether you're a merchant developer, large private equity group, or the local real estate crew in town, developing properties in adjacencies to campus, primarily renting by the bed, fall-to-fall schedules to align with the academic year. Where we come into the mix for the student housing industry is providing those insights for all players in the space, regardless of your respective role. As you look at data and why is it important and why we're understanding and having these meetings like this and discussing different topics. We look at data as a medium of communication. And when you look at that communication and what we need to do from a planning, from a supply and demand perspective, from rents, from occupancies and everything in between, it helps contextualize the conversation. And one of the things that we've done at College House is provide those unique insights, giving you the full picture of what's going on at each respective university. Again, we're covering your large schools, tier 1, above 45,000 total enrollment, down to your tier 3, tier 4 universities that have maybe 1,000 students full time. And what I want to do today is kind of give a lay of the land of how the off-campus world is interacting with the on-campus world. A lot of the metrics that you'll see here is really tied to the performance of the off-campus market. And a lot of that is driven by the supply and demand from the total enrollment and the on-campus housing versus where those students, primarily, your sophomores, juniors, seniors, and grad students, living options in each respective university kind of comply with. As we jump through, is this to go next? Oh man, as the tech guy, you'd think I'd be better at tech. There we go. As mentioned, College House, we cover about 280 university markets across the United States, about 1.15 million purpose-built beds, and about 3,200 plus or minus purpose-built properties across the United States. All of this information is updated on 7 to 10 day basis, so real-time information to each university market, where, again, regardless if you're tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 universities, we have information and analytics for you. As we look at the current state, and all this information is as of Monday, so you have, we're talking in the present tense, pre-leasing. So for those that are not as familiar with this metric, signing leases now to move in for fall. Again, a lot of this starts early October and September in some of your more competitive markets. But we track this, again, across all of our markets, all of our individual properties. And we can see here right now, the leasing velocity, or pre-lease at this current time, is about 74.3%, about 3% behind last year. And if you've been tracking the off-campus market here in the US, last year was a record year. There were properties that were full within a day with 10, 12% rent growth. It was pretty wild. So following up a strong leasing year last year was definitely going to be a challenge. And if we put this in context of the previous years, I've got a slide that shows the last 4 years of the leasing cycles. It's still well ahead of 2021, so coming out of the pandemic. What's unique about this is as we look at pre-lease, what is this an indicator of truly of demand? Are students signing leases? Are they signing? Where are they signing them? At what price point? All of that is an intangible as it relates to the off-campus student housing market. A couple things to note here specifically as we look at the West Coast, they normally have a later start. So as if you look at the Southeast, Northeast, Southwest, most of them start leasing, I'd say like late September, early October, where just based on when the schools move in, I think like University of Oregon moves in around Labor Day weekend. The Southeast is already hot out of the gates from leasing for the following school year. So you have a little bit of lag, so don't look at the 63 or 67% as an indicator of lack of performance. They're just a little bit behind on timing. And as we look at this in context of rent growth, so this would be an achieved pre-lease rent growth for a lease for 24-25. As you can see here, national rent growth is about 7%. I think this time last year we were closer to about 10.5, 11%. With strong leasing velocity. So if you look at, again, the demand was continuing to increase. And as you look at, the price point, again, we haven't reached that medium where you've seen rents decrease or level out. A lot of that, again, driven by the supply and demand factors, which we'll get into here in a moment. But as you look at the rate per bed, Southwest, Southeast, normally seeing a lot more of the investment activity, a lot of your Power 5 schools there. And again, your Midwest, Northeast, and Southwest. Still going strong, But if you look at the context of percentage basis rent growth numbers as it relates to the Northeast and the West, a little higher cost of living, where a $50 increase is, again, a less of a percentage as it relates to the Southeast, Southwest, or the Midwest there. As we jump over here and look at how this trended. So again, this is rent growth over the last 4 years for the off-campus student housing market. You can see, again, the delta between, if we look here in May, 819 to 901, again, that was your kind of part of your peak there as it relates to rent growth last year. Again, a record year, following up another record year here, where we're up about $62 per bed, plus or minus 7% there. This is what is driving a lot of the interest in the investment of the off-campus student housing market. I think recently, I think this was 2 weeks ago, Blackstone sold $1.6 billion portfolio to KKR, 16,000 beds, pretty significant off-campus exit. And then, of course, everybody knows the Blackstone ACC take private. A lot of interest from the big private equity in the sector due to a lot of the metrics that we're talking through here today. And as we look at again, from a demand perspective, again, we're still ahead of this time 2 years ago. But last year, again, we had a record increase. And I think the gap between pre-leasing year over year last year at most was about 12%. So students were signing leases earlier off campus. They were making those decisions, again, far more quickly at a much higher rate because a lot of those great living options, the adjacencies to campus, the highly amenitized properties and buildings that are now, all throughout the United States, have definitely become part of the student living experience. I remember, again, I wasn't in college that too long ago. Actually, my friend said today we graduated from UGA 9 years ago. The market was definitely different then, and it's going to continue to innovate, continue to change. And the challenge with a lot of that is, again, a lot of the macroeconomic factors around rates and costs of cost of development is really driving a lot of the supply and demand imbalances at a lot of these universities. And as we look at floor plans, so one thing that's unique about student housing, I think workforce housing probably has a few of these type floor plans, but density is kind of the key focus here. Studios 1s, 2s, threes, even pretty standard for your conventional product, where the young professionals, families, everyone across the U.S. lives in. Where student housing is unique is you have a lot of your 4s, 5s, and 6 bedroom floor plans. Again, these parcels are getting smaller. The density, it's not uncommon to see, 6 juniors or seniors living together in some of these high-rise or cottage-type products across the U.S. So a couple things to note as we're looking at this. One thing that stands out primarily is if you look at the studios 1s and 2s, you can see some underperformance from a pre-leasing perspective year over year. If you correlate that to a price point and you look down below, you can see that the rents have increased. Again, we're not going to make you do math. I've got the whole math on the next slide. But you can see that the rents are much higher for those respective floor plans. When I take that into account, I look at the cost of living, the challenges as it relates to higher rates per bed in the macroeconomic environment. Things are getting more expensive. The parents, the guarantors on those leases are saying, hey, I know you want to live by yourself, but hey, let's find a friend and save an average of maybe $500 per month, which is pretty significant as you look at it, over 12 months, about $6,000. So definitely one trend that we're seeing nationally is a slowdown in the smaller, more expensive unit types, where this time last year or previous years, a lot of people would be scared to have a 4-bedroom that they have to fill later in the leasing cycle and try and find 4 friends to live together. It's more or less a lot of your studios 1s and 2s, given a lot of the higher price points there. And as mentioned, I'm not going to make you do math, but you can see here, well, actually, I am going to make you do math. My apologies. You can see here, again, a common trend that we're seeing. And as you look at development, as you look at new investment in this space, the lower rates per bed, as you look at a 4-bedroom, say it's whatever the number is, $883. Again, as you look at rent increases or you look at just the overall supply in a market, a lot of this is primarily driven by a lot of your 4-bedrooms, pretty prototypical in student housing from the off-campus side. And we're seeing that being a common trend for new development as well, trying to pack the density, make the numbers work because of the high costs of development and the challenges facing with a lot of the capital stack there. And as we look at this, so student housing also on the off-campus market is kind of broken down into 3 parts. You have your urban products, I guess mid-rise, high-rise. You have your garden style living, which is more of your vintage, more spread out type apartment complexes. Then you have cottage products. So think the Lennar homes of the world where all students are living there. And again, they're each renting by the bed, each individual leases. One thing to note that's unique here, a lot of your new construction is tied to your urban infill. You can see the pre-leasing there is about 74%. whereas your cottage product actually leases up much quicker, which is kind of counterintuitive. You need a larger tract of land. They're not going to be as close to campus, but again, you're either in an apartment, you either live in apartments or you either like houses. Again, the students tend to flock to those cottage style living versus, I guess the urban infill. Again, in a market like a DC or more urban, it's pretty hard to find a cottage product that's within 5 miles of campus. So one of the key things that's more, I would say, locationally focused, where there are tracts of land to facilitate those products being built. And then also closer to campus, the better, is kind of the key thing as it relates to the off-campus market. As you can see here, you're seeing a higher premium on being closer to campus. Again, I mean, from a rent growth perspective, within a half mile to a mile perspective, I mean, the product is performing exceptionally well. Again, you're only about I'd say about 3.5% behind from a leasing velocity. So the demand is still there at the higher price point, which is driving a lot of the new investment activity into the off-campus sector. And as we look at supply, and I think one of the key metrics we look here is, okay, our enrollment's going up. Is there new supply coming into the market? What's that going to do to stabilize product in these respective markets? If you look backwards, so from 2011, kind of the heyday of the development era in student housing, so about 2017, 2018, about 52,000 beds, 53,000, I think it's 52,700 was the average deliveries. So projects all over the United States. As we look at 2019, or kind of present era, so COVID on, that is actually dropping by about 30%. So not only are rents going up, there's not a lot of supply coming into those respective markets. And what we'll get into here in a moment, a lot of these larger universities are growing and growing pretty substantially. As we look at the challenges facing the development market right now, I think one of the key focuses is around cost. If you look at the average rate per bed of a delivery in 2021, in 2022, in 2023, in 21 it was $1,000 per bed. In 21, it was $1,100. 22, it was $1,100 per bed. And this past year, it was around $1,200 per bed. Those are the prices that these developers need to get to make the economics work and I guess to use the real estate term, to pencil. The projects are getting larger. I sat down with actually one of the largest merchant developers in student housing, says, I can build at a little bit lower rate per bed, but I've got to throw 1,500 beds into a market. The price of land correlating to a higher price point as well, because you need a bigger tract for 1,500 beds. But it's definitely a challenge as we look at affordability in a lot of these markets. Again, basic economics, supply goes up, demand goes down, the prices should level out. But in student housing right now, it's very, very, very challenging to get a development deal to get capitalized, to get approved, to move through the proper processes to get delivered in these respective markets. And the timelines also are definitely increasing. I think last year, about 40% of projects that were delivered had some sort of a delay, whether it's a delayed move-in, a day late. So the challenges in the timelines of, if you break ground today and you're going to deliver in fall of 2026, you definitely need not 18 months anymore. It's more like 24. So that's one of the big things as well. The timelines are increasing, which is also challenging from a capital perspective, because that's another 4, 5, 6 months you have to float there, whether you're pulling in from the construction loan or from the capital stack. And enrollment. So we talked about the properties and the supply, and let's talk about the demand. One of the key things, if you look at any article, I think the Wall Street Journal or Forbes put out one that says students aren't going to college anymore. They're not going to college at certain places anymore, but they are definitely still going to college. And one of the key things that we've seen as you look at it from the university profile, tier 1 universities, so think more of your public state schools, the Purdue's, the UT Knoxville's, the University of Georgia's, the Auburn's, the Arizona States of the world. A lot of your more tier 1 institution, big public schools are seeing a lot of increases. And a lot of that is due to the way that they're, the admissions, the interest in a lot of these, the ROI, I think is probably a better term to use there as it relates to the interest from these students, where you're seeing a little bit of a decrease in some of the suffering from an enrollment perspective is in your smaller universities. As you look at your tier 2 and tier 3, you're seeing a decrease of roughly about 1.2% year over year and about 1.8% for your tier 3 universities. I think I saw, a handful of, I wouldn't call it a merger, but if you look at like what happened up at University of Vermont in Burlington, there was a couple other schools that were there. They all kind of came together and created one university versus 3 smaller ones. You're seeing that also down in my home state here in Georgia, where the university system in Georgia for Georgia Southern has now picked up American University, which was in Americus, Georgia, and now has created kind of one entity there. The economics are challenging. If you have declining enrollment, it's hard to raise money or hard to get the endowments to fund new projects unless you have some sort of a change in strategic plan. But if you look at that from a standpoint of where this off-campus money is going, a lot of it is being driven by the Tier 1 universities. That transaction I mentioned with Blackstone and KKR, I think of the 19 assets, 18 of them were in a Tier 1 university. The other, I guess the one other one was actually in a Tier 2, which was probably close to that 20,000 enrollment mark. So a lot of the money is being, invested in these larger universities because the enrollment story, if you have more kids coming, again, the supply demand shakes out in a way that's favorable to the investor. And as we look at this, again, just getting a little bit more granular, you look at just the Power Fives. So if you think the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, if you're a football fan, as well as the Big 12 and Pac-12, you got about 65 or so universities. Enrollment growth's up about 1.7%, where everyone else, as it relates to the non-Power Five, but I would still say is like, if you, again, putting it into a football perspective, the Mountain West, some of your smaller Atlantic American conferences, you're seeing a decrease there from the total enrollment number as you're looking at a year-over-year perspective. So again, the larger schools are getting larger, more students are going there, and you're seeing some challenges as it relates to affordability in a lot of those markets because the supply and demand imbalance is so key. As we look at that from a great example, if you're in the realm of off-campus student housing, Knoxville is your belle of the ball, it's your darling. Enrollment has absolutely skyrocketed over the last few years. I mean, they're up this past year 7%, led in the largest freshman class. They have, I think, it's a two-phase project from a P3 perspective, about 2,200 beds coming. But if you look at the math, that doesn't solve the fact that last year the enrollment growth was also 6%. So you have a ton more students coming to these schools. You have a finite amount of stabilized product. You have a large pipeline, 4,600 beds, but that's going to take time. So over at least the next 2-3 years, you're going to see elevated rent levels because the supply and demand is at such an imbalance. Pre-leasing is 9% behind, but rent growth is 23%. This time, I guess in December, the market was full and still at a similar rent growth perspective. So one of the key things as well is you look at the breakdown of here on the far right, and I'll show this for a couple more universities, but the full-time enrollment, less those on-campus beds, less the occupiable purpose-built beds, so the current inventory, less the development pipeline shows, even with these new beds coming on market, and add 2,000 for the on-campus side, you still have a surplus of 6,300 students that are full-time, whether that be undergrad or graduate, that will be in that market that are not accounted for in the supply demand metrics of the purpose-built community or the on-campus market. So that's a key metric that we're tracking, and a lot of the developers, a lot of the investors are tracking as it relates to each university market. And a lot of people are looking at this from a standpoint of their strategic planning. If you're on campus, hey, we have a strategic plan that says we want to grow enrollment by X%. We got to have a place to house them. You're seeing a similar situation in Auburn, Alabama, where they're having to tear down existing supply because they ran out of land, or they've master leased properties on the off-campus side, where again you're looking at a supply and demand imbalance, which is really driving a lot of the rental growth and the scarcity as it relates to these stabilized products. The best story I tell about Knoxville is I was actually standing with someone in October of last year, and they had a line around the block for the first day of leasing and leased up that day, 600 plus beds. So the demand is there for those premium products that are close to campus, and the students, in most cases in those markets, have no other choice but to pay them, which is a challenge again on the affordability side as we look at kind of the go forward for student housing in general. Another example would be State College. So getting up here into the Northeast, again, you have a much larger enrollment base, but again, up about almost a point there. You got 19,000 purpose-built beds in the market. But again, you're still seeing some decent rent growth. You're behind a little bit, but you're 87% full for next year. And you still have about 14,000 kids or so that are full-time, part-time, or full-time undergrad or graduate that are still going to need a place to live moving forward. So they're in the market, whether they're going to live in the student competitive shadow market, that's up for debate. But again, it just gives some context into why you're seeing such elevated levels of rent in a lot of these markets. Another good example, Charlottesville, Virginia. I know we're here in DC, but call it close as we can to Virginia. And you're seeing a lot of investment activity, a higher rate per bed than you're looking at in more of your southern schools, but you're still performing on 96% current occupancy. You still got about 9,300 students or so that are going to be accounted for without a place to live that was purposely built for them. And you're seeing enrollment go relatively flat. So with a higher price point as it relates to tuition at like a University of Virginia, it's definitely I wouldn't say cause for concern, but if you look at the metrics on campus, the supply and demand is truly at an advantage for those on the investment side versus, from a standpoint that enrollment's declining or there's an oversupply of beds in that respective market. But in a market like Durham, North Carolina, where Duke is, again, a more prominent institution, I would say, although I am, if they're playing UNC, I do choose the Tar Heels. But you can see enrollment's down about 2%. You can see that the market occupancy is up a little bit. I mean, they're at 91% and rent growth is about 11%. Some of that could be attributed to the fact that there's been just such a large influx of conventional product in the research triangle, Durham, Raleigh, and Chapel Hill as well. But you can see pre-leasing is behind 12%. What that tells me that the rents they're charging are too high and that the market's not responding to that. Plus, if you look at that same calculation here on the bottom right, you have an oversupply of about 12,000 beds, whether that's on campus or off campus, excuse me. We have about 1,200 students that are over. If we do the simple math here, if you add or take away those 1,200 beds, again, you'd probably be closer to that 95, 96, 97% occupancy. But again, you just have an oversupply in that market, which is driving, again, a little bit of the outperformance. That's about 3% under the national average on occupancy, about 93.5%, give or take, from a national perspective. So what does all this mean? As we look at kind of the go-forward basis and we look at the importance of information, we look at the importance of data, two key things that I look at is what's happening today, what do we think is going to happen, in the future, and how are we reacting? Are we being proactive or reactive? Where if it's, enrollment's climbing and there isn't enough housing for the universities, you master leasing, you building, you buying some of the off-campus properties. And also if there is a decline in enrollment, is it, something that can be salvaged? Is there, are you going to still have the investment in those respective markets where a lot of your private equity, a lot of your big capital groups or those that are willing to lend in those markets, if the story's not great at the school and the supply and demand's off, it's really, really challenging to have dollars invested in those respective markets. So one of the key things that we look forward are things going to change? I think the two things that need to happen is there needs to be more beds delivered in these respective markets. Knoxville, Tennessee probably could use another 4,600. But a lot of this is being driven where you're seeing that people are piling on. Like in Tallahassee, Florida, there's about 7,000 beds being delivered. Enrollment's been down for the last 2 years. Again, when they were underwriting these properties in 21, enrollment was like here. So all in all, I do not see much of a change here over at least the next year, 2 years, as it relates to elevated rent levels, excuse me. But affordability is definitely going to be a challenge as you look at some of your higher price per bed markets, some of your higher price per bed floor plans, and how, whether you're the owner, the operator, or the manager of those respective assets, what's the go-forward basis? I think the larger unit types still have a lot of runway. A lot of those four bedrooms, 5 bedrooms, 6 bedrooms are leasing up just like that. But it's definitely an interesting time where over at least the next 3 years, you're not going to see back to normalized levels of deliveries, which is going to continue to kind of support the strong fundamentals from an off-campus perspective. Again, can always change, but the larger universities are getting larger, and it's definitely causing a lot of interest from a capital perspective into the sector. So I got about 3 minutes here. If there are any questions, I'd be more than willing to take some Q&A from the audience. So speaking with a lot of our clients, and so if you broke ground today and say we'll just call it 18 months, the projects are bigger. They're a little bit more complex where your parcels, it's not just, hey, here's 2 acres sitting here, you have great access to everything. It's not construction costs. It's not, for lack of a better word, anything that's in your hands from a standpoint of controllables. Things are just taking longer from a construction perspective, from the approvals, from the cities and everything in between. We had one client who had 800-bed product completely done, but the city was saying, hey, we need to make sure that the utilities are good. So it's just more scrutiny around the whole process. Of the, call it 60, 70 properties that were built this past year, I think, again, 30, 40% of them had some sort of delay on delivery. They finished for the most part, but there was some where they didn't get CO for some reason or whatnot. But there's a property actually in Athens, Georgia, where I went to school, University of Georgia. They started leasing up in May of the previous year to make sure that they were ready to deliver on time, because that's one of the biggest challenges. Students looking at the market is like, they can see the property. Is this going to get done? And if not, you got to stick them in a hotel for 6 weeks, 12 weeks. And that's definitely not great for the student. In the back. Yeah. Anyone in my seat would say it's market specific. But if you look at nationally, a lot of the universities, again, the enrollment is there, so they're going to continue to grow. The supply is not there, so you have your stabilized product in the market is becoming more scarce. So I look at it from a standpoint over the next 2-3 years, some elevated levels. And when I say elevated levels, above your traditional 3%. Some markets you may still see double digits. Like a great example would be like a Lexington, Kentucky. Saw a ton of development over the last, I'd say from 2019 to about 2022. There's one project coming in, but their enrollment growth is like 4%. And if you were to say, hey, I want to build a deal in Lexington, Kentucky, University of Kentucky, it's going to be 3 years until that gets done. So all in all, I think your runway is pretty significant, at least for the next 24 months. The optimism that I see is probably closer to 36, because you just don't have the supply that's coming. I think if you look at the 27, the projects we're seeing for 27, or fall deliveries of 27, there's more, but a lot of it's concentrated. So like this year in Madison, Wisconsin, there were 4 projects being delivered. State College, there's 1,200 beds being delivered. If you look at, it's another market with a lot of pipeline. Gainesville, Florida last year, there was 4,700 beds that were delivered. So a lot of it's going to come in waves from a market specific perspective. And if the universities continue to grow, it'll level out and allow the same kind of supply and demand economic factors kind of play out. But I would say over the next 24 months, fundamentals are strong from an off-campus perspective. Similar kind of levels we're seeing now. And it all just depends on affordability. If you got a ton of 4 bedrooms, I think you're going to be 4s, 5s, and 6s. You're going to be in a better position versus those with a lot of studios 1s and 2s, where it's just, a 5% rent increase on $1,200 is way different than a 5% rent increase off $700. So it just depends. But I'm optimistic. Again, people I'm talking to, they're underwriting 6-7%. They're in 26-27 school year. A lot of those guys are winning the deals that are in the market too. Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. And I'm around if anybody has any other questions.